Hello friends, this is Adam with Movie Guy 365, and as a 4K collector, I thought I would rank all the Hollywood studios that put out movies on the 4K format and see how they're doing. If you're new to the channel, please hit the like button, subscribe, hit that bell notification. I put out videos every single day. You can also find me over Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd at Movie Guy 365, as well as over at the Disney Magic Hour podcast. I'll put a link for that in the description. Alright, so I thought I would try something a little different today. As a 4K collector, all studios are not created equal as far as putting the movies out on the formats. I think, honestly, and I think a lot of collectors and a lot of enthusiasts would agree that some are a little better than others, that I feel put, more effort, more care into putting movies out on 4K Blu-ray. So I thought I would go from worst to first and talk about those studios and maybe things that they can do to improve what, as far as the overall product goes. So we're going to start with number 7, and my number 7 is going to be, unfortunately, it's going to be Disney. I think a lot of people would agree that the Disney 4K Blu-rays are the least not as good as some of the others, and there's a various amount of reasons why. A lot of it has to do with a lot of times they put out their movies on the 4K format. They are upscales. They're not true native 4Ks. I mean, it's not everyone, but I would say more often than not, if you get a Disney 4K disc, it's going to probably be an upscale, and unfortunately that does hurt the overall quality. And also as far as their audio goes, they tend to mix their audio mixes a little bit on the low side, and it doesn't sound as robust and as strong as you could possibly put out on your own personal home theater. Whether they do that to cater to people, with just smart devices or whatever the reason, there's just those two reasons, I think, in particular, that are not as good as some of the other studios on this list. But that's not to say that they don't have some great looking titles. There's a few titles that, even though they are upscales, that look great. The live action Lion King being one. Whatever your thoughts are on the movie, it still looks fantastic and it looks gorgeous, as well as Toy Story 4, which I do believe was one of the few native 4K titles that was released on the format. And Jon Favreau's live action The Jungle Book also looked fantastic. There are exceptions to the rule, but I think they're a little few and far between, so that's why Disney is my number 7 on the 4K list. My number 6 is going to be Lionsgate. Now, Lionsgate is a smaller studio, so they do put out less of their own original content, and a lot of their 4K releases are actually licensed out. So there are some older titles such as Universal Soldier, The Doors, that are licensed through Lionsgate. They weren't actually produced by that studio, but the 4K discs still look a little bit. I would say Lionsgate is one of those studios that their older titles tend to not look as good, not look as sharp, but their newer stuff looks fantastic. I would say I would use John Wick, the John Wick series, as an example of really well done 4K. And I would use other, like, more current movies like Knives Out, Rian Johnson's film, that also look really good in 4K. But I would say I would ding them mostly on the catalog stuff. It's not as clean, as good. Now, once again, there are exceptions to that, but I feel that Lionsgate, being a smaller studio, needs to kind of try to up their game if they're going to release movies on the 4K format. It should, and they would put out a lot more native 4K, I think. That does occur, but it's still a little bit, there's still some upscaling that is done. Like, I believe the third John Wick was an actual upscale, wasn't native. So I feel that needs to kind of, change a little bit. But I think that where they beat Disney is in the overall audio sense, that their audio mixes are a lot stronger and they're a lot more robust. So I think really in that regard, pretty much edges out Disney in that department. So let's move on to my number 5. Now, really, my top 5 is almost to a point where it's going to be splitting hairs between all 5, and the difference between them is really negligible. But I did want to try to rank them in an appropriate way. So I'm going to go ahead and give Paramount the number 5 slot here. I think they're very strong. Usually they have a very good application of, you know, native 4K. They have a great audio mix presentation. Like their Transformers movies are phenomenal in the 4K format. But then you have a recent movie that just came out, Sonic the Hedgehog, that I felt was a little underwhelming, utilizing any kind of HDR or Dolby Vision. So I feel that Paramount has more hits than misses, but they still are a very good studio as far as catalog and new stuff on the 4K format. The Hunt for Red October being another recent release, I felt that movie looked phenomenal. I thought it looked, for its age, it looked great. Just the black levels looked fantastic. The color palette, the detail looked wonderful. And then, of course, more recent releases like the Transformers spinoff, with Bumblebee, and Terminator Dark Fate. Whatever you think of that movie, it still looks fantastic. It looks wonderful, but I feel that there are still a couple shortcomings when it comes to Paramount. I think it's just it's really a movie by movie basis, but it still looks, I mean, their overall track record is really strong, and they're a great studio that supports the format. It looks great in 4K, and their audio mixes are really just almost second to none here. My number 4 is going to be Warner Brothers. I think overall they are very strong, but it's also another case of almost like a Paramount, where when they're on fire, they're on fire when it comes to 4K, but when they're not, they're not. And I think that kind of applies mostly to the backlog titles, some of the catalog stuff. Now, that being said, there's still some wonderful examples of what Warner Brothers does right. I think for the most part they do the classic catalog stuff. I would say arguably better than anybody else on the list. I think they look great. 2001 looked fantastic. Just overall a great studio. To you know, The Shining. There's a lot of examples of, you know, Warner Brothers and their back stuff. Their more current stuff also looks phenomenal. I mean, Aquaman, I would say, is probably one of the best looking titles on 4K currently. Also, you know, you have Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining, a recent release, looks great. It looks fantastic. I think really overall strong. But then you have a couple movies that just don't look great. One I can think of off the top of my head is Dwayne Johnson's San Andreas on the 4K format. That kind of just looked like it was almost like haphazardly put together. It was just not a good representation of 4K. But I think Warner Brothers is definitely a studio that I absolutely have confidence behind, and more often than not, they just look great. They look fantastic, and then their audio mixes are also pretty impressive. So yeah, I would say Warner Brothers is definitely on the upswing as far as releasing 4K. My number 3 is going to be Universal. Universal is very strong. I think definitely one of the better studios that puts stuff out on the 4K format, and they're very consistent. It's really a struggle to think of a movie that doesn't look great on 4K, and I think honestly they put a lot of effort into their not only their picture quality but their audio. Several movies that came out recently, like Sam Mendes' 1917, looks phenomenal on 4K. It looks great. Hobbs and Shaw also looked fantastic. The Fast and Furious spinoff, and Jordan Peele's Us really utilizes just overall color palette. The dark scenes of that movie look fantastic. It is honestly one of the studios that I'm very confident in. When I get a Universal title, I'm very, you know, I'm going to be pleased with it. And I think overall it's a very great studio that puts out their stuff on 4K, and I think they're very strong, and their audio mixes are also very, very just noteworthy. I think just overall a very good studio, and I don't really have any negatives on them, but it's just a matter of inches when it comes to these top 3. So all right, let's move on to my number 2. My number 2 is going to be 20th Century Fox, and well, probably 20th Century Pictures at this point after the Disney buyouts, which is unusual. You know that Disney pretty much owns Fox in the movie division, but you know Disney themselves are way back on the list, and then 20th Century is up front. But it's really just a matter of overall beautiful looking, just 4K presentations all around. I think I could really just rattle off a whole list of titles that are just really best represent the 4K. The recent release of The Call of the Wild, starring Harrison Ford, beautifully rendered. It's a beautifully rendered 4K picture, and other movies like Ford versus Ferrari. While Ford versus Ferrari is technically an upscale from on the 4K format, it still looks great. It looks fantastic, and the audio presentation is, oh wow, it's awesome. It's really just kind of puts you in that movie, and it is absolutely phenomenal. And then of course there's the one of the original 4K discs to come out for the format, and that's The Revenant. Beautiful looking picture on that one, native 4K HDR10. Just an awesome presentation. Fox, I think, is so consistent. And once again, it's another one of those I really could struggle to find one that just didn't, you know, even their upscales look really good, and they look fantastic. And I think that's kind of what sets them apart from a studio like Disney is their upscales even look great, you know, to almost like native 4K. And I think they just have a great mastering process, and it's really a good overall studio. And hopefully they continue into the future with the 4K format. And my number one is going to be Sony. I think Sony really sets the benchmark. Picture quality, audio quality, I think are top notch pretty much consistently throughout their tenure into the 4K formats. Movies like Jumanji, I think, look phenomenal. Even the original Jumanji to the next level version that came out recently, all look fantastic. They look great. They can handle catalog stuff, I would say, almost better than, I would say I would tie them technically with Warner Brothers. I think Warner Brothers does a wonderful job, but I think Sony is more consistent on that front. I think they definitely have that whole thing dialed in. Just recently, The Mask of Zorro came out, and that looked wonderful. Just like it had great amounts of color, natural to it. The HDR looked fantastic, and just an overall wonderful presentation of that movie. It was made in the 90s. And it just is a great studio. I think they are very consistent, very strong, and they get it. They get what makes 4K 4K. And their native stuff looks great. Their upscale stuff looks great. Even their animation looks fantastic. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse being one of those examples. While that is also an upscale, it still looks wonderful. It just looks vivid on your screen. Hotel Transylvania 3, I think, is probably beats it in the vivid category as far as animation style, but it looks wonderful on the disc, and it's just an absolute beautiful presentations. Animated and live action, they all look great, and they are all fantastic. It's all really good, and I think that's why they're my number one studio as far as putting 4K stuff out on disc. So that is my ranking of the studios and how they handle 4K on home media. Let me know in the comments below if you agree with the list, or what do you feel are some of the better studios that, well, which studio would really is your number one. So let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, hit that bell notification. I put out videos every single day. So until next time, this is Adam with Movie Guy 365. I will see you at the movies.